He was gentle, sensitive, endlessly kind. At home, he was a soft-spoken prankster. He'd make the kids giggle, play tricks on the family dog, and light up the room with a silent wink. He was the kind of man who could make a toddler laugh without even moving a muscle. To the world, he was the curly-haired clown who never spoke. But to those who knew him, Harpo Marx was more than a character. He was a contradiction. Chaos and calm, thunderous laughter and quiet strength. He was the only Marx brother who didn't say a word. And yet he's the one millions still remember. He came into the world as Adolf Marx on November 23, 1888, a name history would later bury under tragedy, timing, and transformation. But back then, in the immigrant neighborhoods of New York City's Upper East Side, Adolf was just another child born into a family too poor to dream small and too scrappy to settle. His parents, Sam and Minnie Marx, had come from Germany and Alsace, and like so many Jewish families of the time, they lived in the suffocating crush of tenement life. Overcrowded, underheated, and constantly echoing with the sounds of children, street vendors, and elevated trains rattling above 93rd Street. In those tiny quarters, Adolf was neither the oldest nor the youngest, but somewhere in the messy middle. A quiet, observant boy in a very loud family. Minnie, his mother, ruled with ambition disguised as maternal duty. She was only about 5 feet tall, but she was a towering presence, and she had no use for weakness. There wasn't enough room in the apartment for soft feelings or personal space. Laughter, yes. Chaos, definitely. But not softness, at least not openly. And yet, it was in this swirling, barely contained storm that Adolf developed a quality that would define him forever. He watched. He watched his brothers, Leonard, Julius, and Milton, jostle for attention. He watched his mother stretch a loaf of bread across 7 plates. He watched his father come and go from tailor shops that never paid enough. And most of all, he watched people. Their habits, their little tells, their unspoken sadness. Even then, he didn't speak much, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't feel the need to fill the silence. It was as if, from the very beginning, Adolf understood that sometimes the loudest thing in the room wasn't a voice. It was presence. There were moments of warmth in that cold apartment. Shared jokes, improvised songs, bursts of music from a battered upright piano. But there were also winters where frost formed on the inside of the walls, and summers where the air was so thick with humidity and body heat that sleep was nearly impossible. Disease passed quickly through buildings like theirs, as did bad news. But Minnie had one unshakable belief. Her sons were going to make it. Not as doctors or businessmen, but as entertainers, stage performers, vaudevillians. She didn't just dream it, she made it happen. And she started by renaming her sons, reshaping their identities like a manager would mold her talent. Adolf would become Arthur in 1911, long before Adolf became a name the world would recoil from. But even before the name changed, the boy had already begun to disappear into the man he would become. Quiet, watchful, sensitive in a way that didn't quite fit the world around him, but would one day make him unforgettable on a stage. If home was a pressure cooker of ambition, school was something far worse, a battleground. For young Adolf Marx, public school in early 1900s New York was no sanctuary. It was brutal, indifferent, and, for a sensitive, observant child, unlivable. Being Jewish in a predominantly Irish and German neighborhood meant he was marked from day one. But it wasn't just name-calling or playground teasing. This was physical, relentless cruelty. There are accounts, not exaggerations, not one-time incidents, of classmates hurling him out of a second-story window when the teacher stepped out of the room. Not as a prank, as ritual. He hit the ground more than once, not figuratively, literally, and when he'd dust himself off, he wouldn't fight back or shout. He'd just take the pain, absorb the humiliation, and return to his desk. Until the day he didn't. One afternoon, after yet another fall, he rose silently, walked out of the building, and never went back. No speech, no protest, no second chances. He quit school for good, a second grader making a final, adult decision. And that, in its own quiet way, was an act of rebellion. In that moment, a seed of something deep and lasting took root, a resolve to protect himself not with fists or fury, but with distance. To retreat into a world of inner safety, where silence wasn't weakness but armor. He wasn't trying to escape reality so much as rewrite it. Without school, He became invisible to institutions, but vividly alive in the world he created for himself. He'd drift between stoops and alleyways, not as a runaway, but as a free agent. School had failed him. The system hadn't just overlooked him, it had thrown him out the window. But in those empty days and unstructured hours, something else began to grow. A sharpness, a sense of humor shaped by survival, and an uncanny ability to read a room before it knew it was being read. His education wasn't gone, it had simply changed shape. Now the streets would teach him. And Harpo, though he wasn't called that yet, would become their best student. After leaving school behind, young Arthur Marx slipped into a world that didn't ask for credentials. No teachers, no grades, no windows to be thrown from, just the cracked sidewalks of New York, a city both cruel and strangely forgiving to kids who knew how to disappear in a crowd. He wasn't a runaway, he was just loose, untethered, a quiet figure weaving through alleys and fire escapes, learning to survive without being seen. The streets were rough, but not without rhythm. Arthur learned the timing of traffic, the body language of con men, the way a drunk's shoulders dropped before a swing. He watched the way people protected themselves, how they joked just before stealing, how the smart ones moved without making noise. In the brothels and pool halls he'd sneak through. He'd find sounds, music mostly, that seemed to explain things better than words ever had. Piano melodies and smoky parlors spoke to him more clearly than any textbook ever had, and eventually he'd find himself drawn toward the instrument like it was calling to him. He was just a kid, but already deeply attuned to the adult world's strange contradictions, cruelty wrapped in charm, rules that bent for the rich but snapped for the poor. And somehow, he didn't grow bitter. He grew curious. The alleys weren't just paths between buildings, they were backstages. He was watching the city perform for itself, shopkeepers shouting over one another, violinists playing for coins on corners, boys selling newspapers with headlines they didn't read. There was theater everywhere, unscripted, unpredictable, and absolutely electric. Arthur began to internalize all of it, the pauses in conversation, the comedic timing of street banter, the precise second to pull a face and get a laugh. Even then, without consciously knowing it, he was building a language, not with words, but with looks, gestures, and movement. The streets taught him that a twitch of the eyebrow could land like a punchline. A pause could hit harder than a punch. And when he later transformed into Harpo, all of that silent education would come pouring out. In every horn honk, every harp string, every wide-eyed stare into the camera that seemed to say, "You and I get it, don't we?" Back then, he couldn't have imagined a life on screen. He was just trying to stay warm. But the alleys had already become his stage, and he was learning how to perform in a world that had never asked him to speak. By the time vaudeville called again, Arthur wasn't the same boy who'd walked out of school. He was sharper now, more tuned to subtext, a kid who could slip into any room and read the air like a script. Minnie, ever the relentless manager mother, had never let up. Her vision for her sons hadn't changed. They would be stars or they would be nothing. And so Arthur returned to the family act, not as the weak link, but as a sponge, soaking up stagecraft, musicality, comic timing, and the rhythms of the crowd. At first, he tried talking on stage like the others. He had lines, written, memorized, delivered. But something didn't click. His voice felt misplaced, like a violin trying to hold its own in a brass band. He wasn't bad, but he wasn't funny. Not the way Groucho could slice with sarcasm, or Chico could dance through a punchline. Then one night, mid-performance, the audience laughed harder at Arthur's expressions than at his dialogue. A missed cue, a panicked reaction. No line, just his wide eyes and flustered silence. And the house erupted. That accident became revelation. He began stripping away the lines, one by one, and leaning into pantomime, not because he couldn't speak, but because he didn't need to. His body said everything. His eyes held the punchline before it landed. While the others talked, Arthur let his silence swell with mischief. He stopped being a performer trying to keep up with his brothers and started becoming something else entirely. A comic force of nature, free from words and therefore unpredictable. The name Harpo came the way many things in his life did, by chance. During a poker game with friends, fellow performer Art Fisher began handing out nicknames based on instruments. Chico played the piano. Groucho, the Grouch. Arthur, He played the harp, awkwardly, passionately, and with an instinctual grace. "Harpo," Fisher said. It stuck. With the name came the persona, a mop of curly red hair, an oversized trench coat filled with absurd props, and a battered horn that became his voice. He built the character the way a kid builds a secret hideout, adding oddities, testing reactions, seeing what made people laugh. A spoonful of mashed potatoes in the hat, a fish in the pocket, a side-eye glance that made audiences feel like they were in on the joke. And yet, underneath the wild costumes and clowning, Harpo wasn't just putting on a mask, he was finally taking one off. Without speaking, he could be completely himself. Strange, sweet, impulsive, and endlessly expressive. It was the first time the world leaned in not to hear him, but to watch him, and they couldn't look away. In 1929, the Marx Brothers debuted in film with the Cocoanuts. The world saw them in a new light. Groucho with his lightning wit, Chico with his musical flair, and Harpo, mute and magnificent. He didn't say a single word. He didn't need to. He'd pull out absurd items from his coat, a fish, a candle, a tiny hammer, and stared directly into the camera, wild-eyed, like he was sharing a secret joke with you and you alone. He became comedy's quiet rebel, a mime in a world of mouthpieces. But silence came with a price. When NBC offered Groucho and Chico a lucrative radio show, Harpo wasn't included. How do you feature a silent performer in an audio-only medium? You don't. While his brothers earned thousands per week, Harpo was left out, again reminded that silence, while golden on stage, could be isolating off it. Still, Harpo had carved out something rare, a comic identity that transcended sound. He made silence roar. Harpo didn't learn harp the way most people learn instruments. He simply picked one up and started playing. He didn't know how to read music. He didn't even know how to tune it properly. For 3 years he played with the wrong tuning and turned the mistake into a style. Even classically trained harpists were astonished by what he could do. His technique was raw, emotional, and entirely original. The family had only enough money for piano lessons for one child. Chico got them. But Harpo? He listened from the hallway and memorized everything he heard. It was pure instinct, and it made his music unforgettable. Harpo's real life was just as peculiar as his on-stage one. He lived next door to Rachmaninoff, and got so fed up with the constant practicing that he blasted Rachmaninoff's own symphony through a phonograph until the maestro moved. He crashed lavish Hollywood parties dressed as Kaiser Wilhelm and got arrested for it. He once let Oscar Levant, a notoriously unstable pianist, live with him rent-free for over a year. No questions asked, just compassion. Harpo wasn't just a clown, he was a caretaker. A soft soul in a city that rewarded the hard-edged. At the height of his fame, Harpo fell in love. It was real, tender, grounding. He was ready to propose. But the day before he planned to ask, she died in a plane crash. The silence he'd used to entertain became the silence of grief. For years, he avoided love. Then came Susan Fleming. They met at a glamorous Hollywood party. She was bold, brilliant, and unafraid. She proposed to him, not once, 3 times, and each time Harpo declined, scared to lose again. But on the 3rd try, something shifted. He said yes. They married in secret. President Roosevelt himself sent them a congratulatory telegram. Susan left acting. They adopted 4 children and built a home full of love, music, and laughter. Harpo once said, "I want so many kids that when we drive by a house, there can be one in every window waving to us." In 1933, Harpo was named a Goodwill Ambassador to Soviet Russia. It was almost laughable, the most unlikely diplomat in history. But behind that wild grin was a keen observer. The Soviets didn't trust him, of course. Who sends a mute comic to Moscow? They assigned him a personal handler. Harpo smiled, nodded, and made mischief anyway. Behind closed doors at the U.S. Embassy, he was handed a top-secret document. He taped it to his leg and smuggled it back to America. No words, no questions, just trust. In 1963, during a live performance, Harpo stepped forward after the final bow and did something no one expected. He spoke. For the first time in his adult life, in public, he used his voice. No gags, no jokes, just a sincere message of gratitude and goodbye. The audience sat frozen, stunned. The silent man had spoken, and it meant everything. Harpo passed away a year later on September 28, 1964, his 28th wedding anniversary. His timing, even in death, was perfect. At his funeral, Groucho's son said he saw his father cry for the first time. Because Harpo Marx wasn't just the clown with the horn. He was the heart of the Marx Brothers. A man who survived cruelty, found his voice in silence, turned a harp into poetry, and built a world of laughter with nothing more than a smile. And maybe that's why we still remember him. Not for what he said, but for everything he never had to. If this story touched you, give the video a like and subscribe for more untold legends of old Hollywood. The stories that didn't make headlines, but made history. Stick around. There's always another forgotten voice waiting to be heard.